Everything happens within a context. If we go back to 1989 when the Hillsborough disaster occurred, it occurred in the context of a Tory government, of the government under Margaret Thatcher. It was a government that had, where there was a clear north-south divide, and, you know, working class people were pilloried. Football supporters were treated like animals. They were treated as subhuman. And Liverpool in particular had a very negative reputation. There was militant council in the city, and we were deemed to be rebellious, whatever that means. I actually question that. I don't think Liverpool is anywhere near as rebellious as it should be, actually. And it's not that easy a place to organise either. But that was the context. So when Hillsborough happened, it was the full whammy. It was, in the main, working class Liverpool football supporters. So there was nothing down for people. Plus, the icing on the cake, it happened in South Yorkshire, it happened in Sheffield. And South Yorkshire police had done a great job for Margaret Thatcher in policing the miners' strikes. And you have to look at Hillsborough within the context of that policing, because it's not only us that looked at it that way, it was South Yorkshire police themselves. I was employed as an academic researcher that monitored the legal proceedings after Hillsborough, so I sat through all the inquests, and what I became aware of was senior officer after senior officer, when they gave evidence, it was their proud boast that they were used to dealing with crowds like this because they'd policed the miners, because they'd policed the poll tax riots. So that was the context in which their expertise was brought to the fore. And what it was basically saying was this was a lawless crowd, and they had to be treated this way, and they were somehow complicit in their own deaths. Because even, you know, looking at Sean's tragic death and looking at all the other deaths in custody, and I know there are people here tonight, what really disgusts me and really truly saddens me over such a long period of time is that the consistency of deaths in police custody, particularly black deaths in police custody, over such a long period of my lifetime. And we can reel off the names of those we know, but what about those that didn't have families, weren't part of a vibrant community, and they did literally get away with murder? Well, because they get away with it when there is campaigns based around it. So that, to me, is the tragedy. But the common thing is there are groups of people where the police feel justified in behaving in a particular way, and they can do that because they can get away with it. Because it was you know, referred to there, the role the media plays in portraying people in a particular way. Football supporters in the 80s were seen through the lens of hooliganism. And whilst there's some evidence to warrant that, certainly not to treat people the way they were treated. In relation to Hillsborough and the investigation after, there was no evidence of violent behaviour. The fans who were, through the propaganda machine, were considered guilty of causing the deaths. They were actually the heroes of the day because they saved so many more lives. But we now know that immediately after the disaster, South Yorkshire Police put in place a propaganda unit, and that unit met in a restaurant where they actually created a story. And it was as calculating as this. The cover-up to Hillsborough began on the very day, while there were dead bodies lying in a gymnasium, which was a temporary mortuary. The coroner, the pathologists were getting the stories straight about what had happened. And there was even talk by the coroner of no need to have post-mortems because we know how they died. So within that context, South Yorkshire Police created the picture of drunken, ticketless fans that caused the disaster. That information was then successfully leaked to a Tory minister, Sir Evan Patnick, who then leaked it to a press agency in Sheffield, White's press agency, that leaked it to the press generally. And that is how you have the notorious Sun headline, and which is why we still boycott the Sun in Liverpool. And that was part and parcel of how orchestrated the cover-up was. When you think it couldn't get any worse, South Yorkshire Police then brought in an investigating force to investigate their behaviour. Who did they bring in? West Midlands Police. West Midlands Police were notorious for their, think Birmingham 6. Their serious crime squad had previously been disbanded for corruption. One of the main officers who has proved to have been part of the major cover-up of investigating Hillsborough was a man called Stanley Beachy, Chief Superintendent Stanley Beachy. He was a former head of the serious crime squad. And in the House of Commons in the February, prior to the disaster happening in the April, Claire Short, the MP, actually raised his name in relation to a corruption case where he had been involved in setting someone up on an armed robbery charge. The guy actually became a very good friend of mine, the guy who'd been set up, and he's now dead, unfortunately. He'd been set up on an armed robbery charge where he had committed, allegedly, an armed robbery in Leicester. Stanley Beachy had provided his tout with a car and with a gun, to say it was this guy, George Tompkins' gun and his car that was... In actual fact, George Tompkins was in Liverpool. Irony of ironies, the man was from Liverpool. He was actually in Liverpool at the time the robbery occurred. It didn't stop police arresting him and in spending 18 months in Winson Green prison on this trumped-up charge. He later successfully, many years later, took a case against them. But this officer was named in the House of Commons in February 1989, and yet nevertheless it was deemed okay to have him playing an active role in investigating Hillsborough. And what I say is, it was no accident that he was in there, or West Midlands Police were in there, because they were brought in for their expertise, and their expertise was corruption and cover-up. It's as simple as that. This guy was great at falsifying evidence. In fact, only tonight, before I was picked up at Oxford Road, I was speaking to a survivor of Hillsborough who just told me he'd seen another person's statements who was also at Hillsborough, and he'd made 3 statements because they kept getting them to change the statements, and he said, guess who do you think visited him to make him change his statement, Sheila? And it was this guy, same guy, Stanley Beachy. And I sat through the inquest and I watched that man sit as the coroner's right-hand man and police the whole proceedings. They used the inquest, and this is another important point in the deaths in custody, they used the inquest to police the situation and to falsify evidence, but also to suppress evidence, and that was very clear in the Hillsborough cases. And after the longest inquest recorded in British legal history, and I think I said it before, but the coroner actually, it was his proud boast when he came into court one day and said we were eligible for the Guinness Book of Records. That was how, the disregard, he's sitting with families, and yet, hey, we can get in the Guinness Book of Records now. This is the longest inquest, the longest corrupt inquest. Another aspect of that is when you're involved in any way around contentious issues, how you are policed, whether you be the family or whether you be anyone actively campaigning and supporting people. I wasn't at Hillsborough and I didn't lose anyone there, but through my involvement of research, and initially I got to know families and I got to know survivors, and I'm still very close with a lot of those people, and eventually continued working in a voluntary capacity. But I think it's worth pointing out how that impinged on my own life, because when I was in Sheffield, I spent a lot of time in Sheffield. I was constantly followed around by 2 West Midlands police officers, plainclothes guys, who sat in the court, till in the end I turned round and confronted them and said, look, do you want to know who I am? Because this is getting silly, because I couldn't go anywhere for being followed around. But equally as well, my home was broken into on 2 occasions, and on one occasion, anything that had a street currency, television, video, I'm that old, yeah, anything that you'd have got easy money for on the streets was still there, and the only thing that was stolen was my address book. And we now know through the work of the Leveson Inquiry, through Tom Watson MP and his work, that that was what they did. Tom Watson swears it's News International that did this to me, but I actually think it was the police, or it might have been both. Our phones were tapped after the inquest verdicts of accidental death. I worked with the lawyers, took the money and ran. Appalling legal representation. The family, the money that the public had collected and put into a disaster fund. Some of that was distributed to the families. They used that money to pay for what they thought was top legal representation. What they got was a steering committee of solicitors that had been set up effectively to fare the police, the families, and their own lawyers shafted them. Their own lawyers sold them down the river. And I'm sure there's people in this room who've got experience of that. And if I was to give any advice, I'd say, shop around and ask people, and do not waste your time or your money with some of the sharks that are out there, because there are also some very good people. It just took us a long time to find them. But the point is that it became very difficult when we were going to the High Court. 6 families, I got some good people who do the legal work for free. We went to the High Court in 1993, and during the lead up to that, all our phones were tapped, the 6 families and mine. And it's silly because, you go, well, how do you know? But that day it wasn't as refined as it is now with mobile phones, etc. But I would pick up my phone and I would hear one family in the north end of Liverpool talking to another family in the east end of Liverpool. And likewise, they would hear me talking when I was having another conversation. And it became so obvious that it was being tapped that for me it became a joke, because my mother used to ring me and be on the phone. I think anyone who wants to listen to my mother for 2 hours, they're welcome to tap my phone. Because, in the end, you have to make a decision. You're either going to be frightened by these people and give in, because that was the idea, or else you say, I'm going to say what I'm saying over the phone, and the real work's going to go on elsewhere. We're not going to speak, which is what we had to do in the end. And that is the climate in which we had to carry on a campaign where we got no support. It was seen through the lens of football. So a lot of campaigning groups really didn't want to know us because it was just football, and a lot of the people on the left didn't want to know really, and it was difficult to get wide-ranging support, and there were very dark days, very dark times indeed throughout the whole procedure. And you say, well, why don't you give up? And I think everyone, the families can speak for themselves, and I understand. I mean, the Rigg family say it there, they're doing it for the dead person, which I'd like to think I would do. But I didn't lose anyone, and you go, well, why didn't you give up? And you actually gave up a lot to do it. But if you've got a social conscience and you know right from wrong, and there's lies being told, and it really is that thing, if they can come for them today, they'll come for me tomorrow. And I never forget that, because it frightens me what I saw going on over the policing of Hillsborough, and how I saw the extent it went to keep people quiet, to change statements, that if ordinary people, they weren't political, the Hillsborough families weren't political. In fact, loads of them used to have a go at me, and they'd go, well, no, this isn't politics, Sheila, it's not political. And you go, well, yeah, it is really, because look, and and now they don't say that. But the point is, they were just your average person whose kid went the match and didn't come back. But they wised up over time. And, this is where the state always make the mistake. It backfires, because through adversity, people become educated. I know, people who are converted, when things went through courts, some families I know became so conversant with House of Lords rulings, because some of the stuff had gone as far as the House of Lords, and they will debate and discuss with any lawyer around the rights and wrongs. And that to me was inspirational in terms of working with these people. And I used, you can't give up, because it goes to the core of the society we live in. And if we allow the police to get away with this, 96 people lost their lives at Hillsborough. It was unnecessary, it was avoidable, but nevertheless it happened. But everything else after that was totally unnecessary. The whole cover-up was totally unnecessary. And really it backfired because they wanted people to go away. And it's an example of how long you've got to stick at something sometimes. And, you know, I was talking to someone over there before, but I know in the dark days of it, I used to draw inspiration thinking of the Bloody Sunday families and how long they had and the climate in which they tried. And, you know, the other year when Cameron stood up and said sorry, and I know sorry is the currency of the day. It's easy, you know, people are saying sorry all over the place. But nevertheless, those words couldn't have come out of a Tory minister's mouth. You know, they'd have balked at the notion of it. And it's so, so the Bloody Sunday families were a tremendous inspiration in terms of, you know, sort of people carrying on through dark times when there seemed like there was nothing going on for them. When the Hillsborough Independent Panel reported in September, it only came into existence because Andy Burnham, as an MP, came up to the 20th anniversary and started saying, oh, this is, you know, this, you know, I'm here to represent the government and, you know, basically to pat people on the head. And one person in the crowd at Anfield started shouting justice. It's very powerful, actually, if you watch this visually. One person started shouting justice. And there was eventually a crescendo of noise. And that did alter the thing because we'd been pushing, and eventually something gives way. And what happened in September was the Hillsborough Panel report published what we already knew, the truth. And it would be the same when you get a legal stamp, you know, a legitimate stamp on something. Everyone goes, oh, you must be so pleased. But you knew it anyway. It's just the rest of the country didn't know it, and there's a legitimacy about it. And so I'm happy to answer questions on anything if people want, but I just think that, you know, from the policing thing, if you want to really look at how the system, the police as an organisation work, take a look at the stuff around how they covered up and falsified evidence, and it really was barefaced how they did it. And, you know, fair play to all of you, and, you know, any of you involved in campaigns. I think the only way we do it is by sticking together, learning from each other, and actually drawing on each other when we're all feeling a bit down and tired, because everyone needs bolstering up at time to time. But I just think now more than ever, it's vitally important. And the good thing about the Hillsborough thing is I think it has given people a bit of hope that you don't have to give up and you can stick with it. So thanks very much. You know, a legitimate stamp on something. Everyone goes, oh, you must be so pleased. But you knew it anyway. It's just the rest of the country didn't know it, and there's a legitimacy about it. And so I'm happy to answer questions on anything if people want, but I just think that, you know, from the policing thing, if you want to really look at how the system, the police as an organisation work, take a look at the stuff around how they covered up and falsified evidence, and it really was barefaced how they did it. And, you know, fair play to all of you, and, you know, any of you involved in campaigns. I think the only way we do it is by sticking together, learning from each other, and actually drawing on each other when we're all feeling a bit down and tired, because everyone needs bolstering up at time to time. But I just think now more than ever, it's vitally important. And the good thing about the Hillsborough thing is I think it has given people a bit of hope that you don't have to give up and you can stick with it. So thanks very much.